July 23, 1945, 12:30 a.m., the coast of Karafuto, the Japanese half of Sakhalin Island, 950 yards off the beach near the town of Shiritori. A submarine sits on the surface in enemy home waters, USS Barb. Her captain has just given an order no American submarine commander has given in this war. Put a landing party ashore on Japanese soil. 8 men climb into 2 collapsible rubber boats. They carry no torpedoes, no deck guns, no air support. What they carry fits in a single wooden crate. Scrap metal, black powder, and a firing mechanism built 2 days earlier from spare parts in the submarine's machine shop. Their target is a single-track rail line running along the coast, the only line supplying Japanese garrisons on Sakhalin's eastern shore. If they're caught, there is no rescue. This stretch of coastline has no name on any American operations map. The war has fewer than 3 weeks left to run, though no one in that boat knows it. Behind them, Barb herself is the largest liability in the operation. A fleet submarine surfaced this close to an enemy coast cannot dive to safety in time to matter if a patrol boat appears. Every minute she waits offshore is a minute she is essentially a stationary target with nowhere to run. So the question is simple, and it comes straight from the numbers. How do 8 men with no combat engineering training, using a bomb none of them have ever tested against a moving train, plan to destroy that train without firing a single shot? By the summer of 1945, the United States Navy had lost 52 submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic combined, and with them, roughly 3,500 submariners, the highest loss rate by percentage of any American service branch in the war. Submarine Doctrine, hammered out over 3 years of losses, was unambiguous. Submarines sink ships. They do not put men on enemy beaches. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of submarines, Pacific Fleet, had authorized bold operations before: wolf packs, shallow water patrols, even submarine-launched rocket attacks on coastal targets. But landing a party on the Japanese home islands, or territory administered as part of Japan, was not something Comsub Doctrine covered. There was no protocol for it, no equipment designed for it, and no precedent showing it could be done with the crew recovered alive. The reasoning wasn't cowardice, it was arithmetic. A submarine surfaced within 1,000 yards of an enemy coastline is exposed. No depth to dive into, no distance to run before a patrol boat or coastal battery can find her. A dive that normally takes under a minute in open water becomes a liability calculation in shallow coastal shelf water, where the keel can be closer to the seabed than the conning tower is to the surface. Sakhalin shore was patrolled. Japanese garrisons there, cut off from major reinforcement, were still armed, still alert, and still shooting at anything approaching their coast. Every other American submarine operating near Japan in 1945 was doing exactly what doctrine prescribed: torpedoing merchant tonnage, mining harbor approaches, occasionally surfacing to shell a coastal target with the deck gun before diving away. It worked. Submarine tonnage sunk against Japan by mid-1945 had crippled the Japanese merchant fleet almost entirely. It was also, by definition, naval warfare conducted from the water, ship against ship, submarine against target, never boots against beach. No submarine had a landing party doctrine because none had needed one. Fleet submarine crews trained for torpedo attacks, gun actions, and evasion, not for amphibious infiltration, demolition on foreign soil, or the recovery of a party under fire from an enemy-held beach. The equipment reflected that gap. Barb carried no rubber assault boats designed for the purpose, no standardized landmine, no training manual for burying a charge under a rail bed. No one at Pacific Fleet headquarters had ordered a landing party ashore because no one had needed to. The war was being won at sea. What Barb's captain was proposing wasn't a rejection of that logic. It was a use of the one asset doctrine hadn't accounted for: a submarine captain who had already spent 2 years finding gaps in what the enemy assumed a submarine could do. Commander Eugene B. Flucky graduated the Naval Academy in 1935, an engineer by training long before he was a combat officer. That distinction mattered. Where other skippers thought in terms of torpedo solutions and firing bearings, Flucky thought in terms of systems, what a hull, a current, a piece of machinery could be made to do beyond its listed specification. By 1945, he had already rewritten what a fleet submarine was supposed to attempt. In January, Barb sank the escort carrier Unyo, a kill few submarines on any patrol managed against a warship of that class. In June, Flucky had Barb's crew jury-rig 5-inch rocket launchers to the deck and fire them at the town of Shari on Hokkaido, the first rocket bombardment of the Japanese home islands by any U.S. Navy vessel. Built from a weapon system the submarine had never carried before that patrol. The specific detail that explains what came next: Flucky had a standing habit, on every patrol, of taking Barb into water shallower than regulations recommended to get a firing angle no cautious captain would risk. His navigator's charts from earlier patrols showed depths marked in single digits of fathoms under the keel. It wasn't recklessness for its own sake. It was a captain who treated the edge of the rulebook as operational space, not a boundary. His crew had learned the same habit by extension. Officers who served under Flucky later described a command climate where an unconventional proposal was evaluated on whether it would work, not on whether it matched precedent. That climate is what made 8 men willing to volunteer for a mission with no doctrine behind it days later. By the time Barb reached the coast of Karafuto in July 1945, Flucky had spent 2 years training his crew and himself to ask what was technically possible before asking what was normally done. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived through the periscope. For several days, Barb had been patrolling the Karafuto coast, watching Japanese rail traffic through the scope during daylight submerged hours. The track ran close to the shoreline, in places within a few hundred yards of the water. Trains moved on a visible, repeating schedule, hauling freight and troops to garrisons that had no other reliable supply route. Flucky watched the pattern for long enough to notice it was a pattern, not a coincidence. Flucky's officers pointed out the obvious problem. Barb carried no demolition charges designed to be triggered by a train's weight. The submarine's magazine held mines built to be detonated underwater by a ship's hull, torpedoes built to run on a set depth, and scuttling charges built for controlled stationary detonation. Nothing aboard was built to sit under a rail and wait for 200 tons of moving steel to trip it. Whatever they used would have to be invented aboard the boat, from parts never intended for the purpose. There was also the matter of authorization. This would not be a sanctioned operation cleared through Pacific Fleet Command. There was no time to request it, and no guarantee it would be approved if they did. A submarine captain putting his own men ashore on enemy territory on his own authority was a decision with no clean precedent to point back to if it went wrong. Flucky chose instead to ask for volunteers directly, making clear that anyone could decline without consequence. That was the moment the idea nearly died, an undertaking with no orders behind it, resting entirely on 8 men choosing, individually, to say yes to a mission their own Navy had no doctrine for. 8 did. Lieutenant William Walker would lead the party ashore. The mine itself was built in Barb's machine shop over roughly 2 days by motor machinists mate first class Paul Billy Hatfield, using scavenged black powder charges and scrap hardware. No blueprint existed for what he was building. The mechanism relied on a simple principle: 2 contact points held apart by a section of steel, positioned to be pressed together by the weight of a train's wheels passing overhead, closing the firing circuit and setting off the charge beneath the rail bed. The design had to solve a narrow problem precisely: too sensitive, and the trigger fires under the weight of a man's foot during burial, killing the men planting it; too resistant, and it fails to fire under the train it's meant to destroy. There was no factory tolerance to fall back on, only trial and adjustment aboard a submarine with no test range. Before committing the design to the mission, the crew rigged a mock version on Barb's deck and tested the pressure trigger against loads approximating a rail axle. It closed reliably, consistently, within a narrow and predictable range of applied weight, light enough not to fire under a man's footstep, heavy enough to fire under a loaded freight car. They ran the test 5 times. It behaved the same way each time. That consistency is what changed minds aboard Barb. The engineering officers who had raised the loudest objections about carrying an untested, non-standard explosive device ashore were the same men who signed off once the trigger behaved identically on the 5th test as it had on the 1st. If you've made it this far, you already know Barb's crew is committing to something the Navy never trained them for. Hit subscribe, because the next 10 minutes are the part of this story most documentaries leave out entirely. The complication came not in the workshop, but in rehearsal. Launching 2 rubber boats through open surf, fully loaded with 8 men and a live charge, in darkness, off a submarine with no landing craft experience in her crew roster, nearly went wrong before the mission even began. One boat took on water in the swell during a practice launch and had to be bailed and resecured before the actual approach, cutting into the narrow window of darkness they had to work with, and reminding every man involved that the surf, not the enemy, might be the first thing to end the mission. 12:30 a.m., July 23, 1945. Barb surfaces 950 yards off the Karafuto coast. 2 rubber boats go over the side. 8 men paddle for shore in silence. The only sound the dip of paddles and the low hiss of surf ahead of them. They land on a narrow beach. No sentries visible. They move inland roughly 400 yards to the rail line, carrying the charge, shovels, and the firing mechanism in a single crate between them. Every man carries a sidearm. No one expects it to be enough if they're found. They dig. The ground is soft near the rail bed, and the work goes faster than planned. Walker's party places the charge beneath the track, buries the contact points, and camouflages the disturbed earth so the rail bed looks undisturbed to anyone walking the line at first light. A dog barks somewhere near a nearby farmhouse. No lights come on. No one moves toward them. They withdraw to the beach the same way they came, load the boats, and paddle back to Barb. By roughly 2 a.m., all 8 men are back aboard, soaked, uninjured, and accounted for. The submarine has been on the surface, exposed, within 1,000 yards of an enemy coastline for approximately 90 minutes. This is the moment the entire mission either works or it doesn't, and neither Flucky nor his crew will know which until they're already committed to staying in these waters to find out. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. Barb does not simply leave. Flucky holds the submarine offshore, submerged, to observe whether the charge functions, a decision that keeps his boat and crew in dangerous waters for hours after the landing party is already safely back aboard, purely to confirm the mine works. At 4:47 a.m., a Japanese train moving along the coastal line reaches the buried charge. It detonates. The locomotive and the forward cars are destroyed. The rest of the train is derailed. Barb's crew, watching from offshore, log the explosion and the resulting fire. No shots were fired by either side during the raid itself. No American was wounded. Japanese casualties from the derailment were not confirmed by Barb's crew, who were already withdrawing to deeper water by the time the train struck the charge. The human cost sits on both sides of that fact without needing embellishment. 8 American sailors risked capture and summary execution on enemy soil for a single freight train's worth of damage, and the Japanese railway workers and soldiers aboard that train had no warning at all that the war had, for a few seconds, reached exactly the ground beneath them. Barb's 12th War Patrol ended weeks later, and Eugene Flucky received the Medal of Honor for it. Citation covering the rocket bombardment of Shari, extensive shallow water torpedo attacks, and the landing party, though the medal was awarded for the patrol as a whole rather than the raid in isolation. Walker and the 7 sailors who went ashore each received the Navy Commendation Medal. Across her war, Barb was credited with sinking roughly 17 vessels, totaling close to 150,000 tons, among the highest tonnage totals credited to any American submarine skipper in the Pacific War. Flucky went on to a full post-war naval career, eventually reaching the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring. The Karafuto raid remains, by most naval historical accounts, the only American ground combat action conducted on Japanese-administered soil during the Second World War. The reframing fact is this: the raid changed nothing about the war's outcome. Japan surrendered 3 weeks later for reasons that had nothing to do with one damaged freight train on a remote stretch of Sakhalin coastline. What it changed was smaller and, in its way, harder to explain. It proved that the line between what a submarine was built to do and what its crew could improvise was not fixed by doctrine. It was fixed by whoever was willing to test it.